Saturday, August 16th, 1969, at roughly 2 p.m. A young man climbs the stairs behind a large outdoor stage. Before taking the final step, he pauses. He can hear the roar of almost 500,000 people, and he takes a deep breath to steady himself. You see, everything had gone wrong up until this point. His band's current 2 p.m. start time was 10 hours earlier than they were originally slotted to play. The band was caught totally by surprise and nowhere near prepared. But this is rock and roll, and the show must go on. You need to go on right now, otherwise you're not gonna play, a staff member hurriedly told the band. Now, this would be enough to give anyone the pre-performance jitters, but this young man's band was also a relative unknown on the East Coast. They would have to prove themselves worthy of the more established acts on the bill. They had worked too hard for this, and it had to go right. The man repeats a mantra to calm himself. Help me stay in tune and on time. But there was another reason this young musician needed that steadying breath. Roughly 2 hours before, he and his band had taken a powerful psychedelic drug. The event we're talking about is the Woodstock Music and Art Fair, and the man is a 22-year-old Carlos Santana, and he is about to give one of the most powerful and technically impressive performances in the history of rock and roll. It always amazes me that psychedelic rock even exists. It seems like something that could only have come out of the chaos, the insanity of 1960s America. And I should start by saying that there is no clean way to tell this story. Historians, anthropologists, musicologists, they've all weighed in, and there's a lot of conflicting information, or at least conflicting opinions on what psychedelic music is, psychedelic rock specifically, and how it came to be. Also, in my opinion, there's value here that's often overlooked. Psychedelic rock was influential and important in more ways than I think most people realize. It was some of the first modern Western music to deal with intense ideas like the phenomenology of self, of death, and even small stuff like the fundamental nature of the universe itself. Of course, some groups of musicians did this with more finesse than others, but even just broaching some of these topics was so taboo at the time. It's really not something that we should just brush off as, hippie nonsense. I'm David Hughes, this is Charcuterie Sound, and this week we're looking at psychedelic rock, probably one of the most controversial and misunderstood topics that I've covered so far. Also, if you stick around to the end, I'll have some great recommendations that can act as an on-ramp if you're trying to get into this style of music. Also, if you're interested in topics like this, please consider subscribing. It really helps out the channel, and it motivates me to continue to make videos like this one. But right here, right now, in order to understand what psychedelic rock is all about, we have to look at an interesting quirk of Western pop culture. And that's the fact that almost our entire perspective on pop culture is focused on young people. Music, entertainment, fashion, what we might obtusely call Western mainstream popular culture, is not really as focused on, say, 40 to 60-year-olds. And sure, there are products targeted to all ages, but that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about Marvel, Sabrina Carpenter, Minecraft, TikTok. I don't know, I'm over the age of 30, you shouldn't really trust me on this. Right now in the United States, people aged 13 to 20 watch more movies, listen to more new music, and attend more live music events than any other population segment. This creates a pull effect on marketers because it just makes sense that you should put a lot of time and focus towards your most profitable audience. And because of this, we get more cultural projects targeted to young people, a kind of consumerist cycle that perpetuates a youth culture. And we're so completely surrounded by this that it almost seems natural. The inevitable way for culture and society to organize themselves. But this is very clearly not true. Youth culture in America wasn't really the dominant force in pop culture until around the 1950s. And with this strange new youth-centric world, we start to see a larger plurality of ideas, aesthetics, and cultural priorities. And with so much change, inevitably there's some social chafing, and not just in the form of reactionary downward pressure from adult society, but also an upwards pressure from young people. Now the grand narratives of previous generations were to be audited, questioned, altered, or even just tossed aside wholesale if need be. This is the 1960s counterculture movement, and it caused a lot of social friction, similar to kind of what we're seeing today. But most importantly for us, this is the environment in which psychedelic rock is born. But to really take off, it needed a little push from something else that the kids were starting to get up to, and that is LSD. The discovery of LSD, much like penicillin, was an accident. But unlike penicillin, LSD makes you trip the f*** out. Its discoverer, the chemist Albert Hofmann, became the first person to experiment with the drug, finding some mild, but in his words, not unpleasant effects after absorbing some of the compound through his skin. And then, like an absolute madman, 3 days after his accidental encounter with the psychedelic, he then intentionally dosed himself with 250 micrograms of the drug before cycling home from work. He was thinking that that would be an extremely conservative and safe amount, but he had actually just ingested a mind-bending quantity of the substance. And not surprisingly, he freaked out a bit. But eventually he calmed himself down and began to enjoy his experience. Little by little, I could begin to enjoy the unprecedented colors and plays of shapes that persisted behind my closed eyes. Kaleidoscopic, fantastic images surged in on me, alternating, variegated, opening and closing themselves in circles and spirals, exploding in colored fountains, rearranging and hybridizing themselves in constant flux. If it sounds like that could be the lyrics of a song by the Byrds, it's because this is straight up psychedelic language. Some writers have attempted to sanitize psychedelic rock by minimizing the influences of substances, but it's very clear that LSD, popularized by figures like Aldous Huxley and of course Timothy Leary, was having a direct influence on youth culture, the anti-war movement, new spiritual movements, as well of course on rock and roll. And it all started here with a man on a bicycle freaking out. Now, I'm fully aware that cultures around the world and throughout history have integrated music and psychedelic experience, and I am by no means trying to minimize the importance of those practices. In fact, a lot of psychedelic bands in the West looked abroad for evidence of the psychedelic in music, so it makes a lot of sense that these traditions would actually be reflected in 60s music, and you do hear it. Again, some of course did this with more finesse than others. Another thing that I'd like to clear up really quickly before we delve any further is that I think we should take this music seriously. It's become all too easy of a punchline. It's everything wild and hedonistic and crazy about the 1960s. That being said, there's nothing wrong with a good joke, and certainly there's plenty within the canon of psychedelic music that seems silly or even wildly naive, you could say. Although I do think when you're trying something new or experimenting, there's always a risk that you're going to look silly or naive or cringy. So that being said, let's try not to give in to cynicism completely. Let's meet the music on its own terms and try and rid ourselves of some preconceived notions of what psychedelic music should look like and sound like. Let's do our best to start with a clean slate, which I think is extremely important. Because the hippies, the heads, these psychonauts, they also didn't pop into existence randomly. They weren't in some cultural vacuum separated from the rest of American society. Psychedelia grew out of existing aspects of American culture with some notable additions from abroad. There were beatniks, gonzo journalists, homegrown gurus, a new wave of American poetry, and not to mention an explosion in science fiction and fantasy literature, which when combined helped create fertile ground for the psychedelic phenomenon to grow and develop. But the origins of psychedelic rock lie much deeper in the American experience. And that's because you can't tell a story about rock and roll without mentioning the blues, or at least you shouldn't. And this is particularly true of psychedelic rock. I mentioned earlier that psychedelic rock introduced a bunch of fresh ideas into the American musical landscape. Well, that was partially untrue. It may have introduced more darkness and mystery to the musical mainstream, but there's a lot more of psychedelic rock already present in early blues than you might have expected. Songs about death, the esoteric, the questioning of religious norms, and a near constant exploration of the existential crisis. And of course, substances. All things early rock and rollers, pre-psychedelic era, actually sanitized to some extent. And the 60s brought back this freedom in a big way, that edge and the unknown. Not all at once, of course. You can hear it evolve out of 60s garage rock, singing about what it was often like pouty love songs, pouty teenage love songs. Kinda just rebellious enough, I guess, without threatening anything systemic. A good example of one of these songs would be something like Eddie Cochran's Summertime Blues. Check it out. Here's a small sample of the lyrics. I'm gonna raise a fuss, I'm gonna raise a holler, but I'm working all summer just to try to earn $1. Every time I call my baby to try and get a date, my boss says, no dice, son, you gotta work late. Sometimes I wonder what I'm gonna do, but there ain't no cure for the summertime blues. There is rebellion here, but it's kind of undirected, uncurious. But you get the sense that this rebellion isn't working out so much for this kid, that he knows it's kind of all in vain. We'll see how music and youth culture in America shifted during the 1960s with another song example in a moment. But first we have to understand the rise of the teenager. There's a popular idea that the American teenager was invented by marketers in order to better target different age brackets according to their changing priorities. Let's call this the Mad Men theory of teenagers. And with the amount of products directed at teenagers in the 50s and 60s, there's definitely something to this. But I, as well as the vast majority of academics who study the phenomenon of the teenager in America, see it as a symptom rather than a cause. And of course, people have been turning 13 for a long time. But this intense cultural separation between the two groups is pretty new. Individuals in this age group used to be considered young adults, fully formed. Useful labor in an agrarian economy transitioning into the industrial, where especially for boys, growing up quickly was a way to earn respect, better pay, or better prospects for marriage. Teenagers as a cultural phenomenon also didn't pop into existence overnight. There are a few things that were necessary, like prerequisites for the existence of teenage culture. And in America, that was compulsory education, cars, cash, and peace. I know that sounds a little crazy. Let's run through it really quickly. So, compulsory education. What could that have to do with psychedelic music? Well, it's really all about space. In the States, the idea of having to go to school spread throughout the country beginning in the 1850s, with states slowly signing on through to the year 1918. But the new public school system, or really systems, slowly evolved into what we recognize today. But they functionally created a third space for adolescence, a place where a separate culture could possibly develop. Next, you have cars. And this is especially important for all that pouty romantic angst. The careful system of courting under parental supervision, a hallmark of previous generations, was dealt a serious blow with the more widespread affordability of automobiles and their use by teens. Also, Eisenhower's new interstate highway system made it easier and more tempting to make that escape, or maybe just go to college a little further away from home. This gave young people more autonomy and more power. Now, peace is really important as well. In the 60s, we have generations that fought in World War I and World War II. Of course, there was also the Korean War. But the generation that created psychedelic rock had grown up in relative peace. This is the so-called Pax Americana that followed World War II. Of course, there was also a Cold War that was bubbling away behind all things, and it was a Cold War that would eventually grow hot in proxy conflicts, the most important of which, of course, is the Vietnam War, which would become the Great Interrupter, disturbing the peace which had become the norm for our counterculture generation. And there you go, you have the perfect cocktail for teenagers and the counterculture more generally to develop. You have these educated consumers of a wide variety of media who view themselves as distinct and separate from adults, and also place a high value on peace. So now we've learned a little bit about the history of psychedelic rock, its deep roots in blues, but also how it grew out of that pouty, angsty 60s garage rock sound. But when and how does it make that leap to the psychedelic? It's pretty hard to definitively say. But if you've watched my channel before, you know I'm always harping on about the different ways that we can define and perceive genre as an idea. So stay with me here, because this is pretty important when it comes to psychedelic rock. You can look at genre through cultural consensus. So Staying Alive by the Bee Gees is disco because most people agree that it's disco. This is like a socially constructed theory of genre. Or you could be more technical and look at musical characteristics. So Staying Alive has strings, it's got a 4-on-the-floor dance beat, therefore it's disco. That's why it's disco. It's these different musical characteristics that make up what it means to be disco. So that's very different than the cultural consensus one. But you can also look at genre just as a taxonomical tool. It's an imperfect label that we use so that we can talk about stuff. All of this makes it really difficult to pinpoint when a genre begins. And it becomes especially complex when looking at psychedelic rock. It just has a lot of influences. You see a lot of bands in the early 60s messing around with elements of the psychedelic sound, and you see a lot of psychedelic lyrics and poetry. But still, it's not psychedelic rock yet. It's still maybe psychedelic folk. You can also see some references to psychedelic substances in surf rock. There's a song called LSD 25 by the Gamblers in 1960, so that's pretty early to have something called LSD 25. At this point in the early 60s, the psychedelic sound is not well defined. Personally, I think that leap to the psychedelic only really starts to happen once artists start experimenting with sounds that are supposed to mimic the psychedelic experience. They're trying to take their experience on psychedelics and represent it sonically. For example, a well-known effect of LSD is an altered experience of time. Garage rockers drew parallels to this experience by altering tempos or percussive emphasis. Some bands even started to incorporate long droning segments that were somewhere in between a solo and a breakdown. These are often referred to as rave-outs or freak-outs, and they're meant to capture some of the disorientation or depersonalization of substances like LSD. And a lot of this experimentation was happening in the counterculture capital of San Francisco, specifically the Haight-Ashbury district. This is the scene that produced psychedelic acts like the Grateful Dead or Jefferson Airplane. But at the same time, the psychedelic movement wasn't a strictly Californian phenomenon. From Greenwich Village in New York City to Carnaby Street in London or the Kreuzberg area of Berlin, it seems like young artists all around the world were taking that pinch of psychedelic. And at this time, the counterculture develops a different flavor than it had previously. Remember the song we explored earlier, Summertime Blues? It had an angsty teenage thing going on. Let's compare that to the song White Rabbit off of Jefferson Airplane's 1967 record, Surrealistic Pillow. One pill makes you larger, and one pill makes you small. The ones your mother gives you don't do anything at all. Go ask Alice when she's 10 feet tall. Here, the rebellion is targeted. It's against the ideas of a previous generation. Using the well-known fantasy story Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland as a familiar psychedelic metaphor, the direct has been replaced by the abstract. And this time, there is a cure for the summertime blues. And that cure is the psychedelic. Psychedelic rock has a lot of influences, and as it began to develop, it became recognizable for a few distinct musical characteristics. Of course, at its core, it was rock and blues and folk, but it also borrowed from jazz, from Western classical music, from Indian classical music, and a smattering of different Latin American genres. But as far as instruments go, you have the standard rock setup of bass, guitar, drums, and vocals, but often with additional instrumentation from organ, auxiliary percussion, and backup vocalists. Harmonicas, mellotrons, and Indian instruments like the sitar and tampura are also very common. On the guitar, musicians were experimenting specifically with effects pedals like fuzz and the famous wah-wah pedal, while incorporating more melodic complexity via jazz and adopting different tunings to emulate Indian-style microtonality. And bass guitarists were also exploring. Improvised bass solos became a staple of psychedelic breakdown segments, but it's just as common to hear the bass behave as a simple drone, repeating maybe a single note. It becomes a tonal center that the other musicians can play around. When it comes to drums, psychedelic percussion often expands the traditional rock set with additional cymbals, cowbells, and chimes, as well as additional drums like bongos, congas, and tablas. This first wave of American psychedelia reached its peak in the late 1960s, perhaps reaching its zenith of cultural relevance in 1969 with the Woodstock Music and Art Festival in Bethel, New York. While not all acts that performed were psychedelic, many were, like Jefferson Airplane, Santana, the Grateful Dead, Jimi Hendrix, and of course psychedelic rock would continue, although its sound began to diversify significantly as you move into the 1970s. And also other subgenres would develop out of this original scene. A logical extension is prog rock, which takes on a lot of the same musical characteristics. And of course there are revival movements that continue to this day. that experimental ethos of the 1960s is still very much with us. Now, before we get to the recommendations, I just wanted to mention that psychedelic music in the 1960s was not a monolith. The sound in London was very different from the acid rock of California, and really you can break this genre down into a million pieces. But I'm going to take a more holistic approach and try and give you a bird's eye view of the psychedelic movement in the 60s. So this is just my list. There might be some things that you would add and some things that you would definitely omit, but it's just to act as an on-ramp for people who want to get into the style of music. Hope you enjoy. Okay, here we have it. 10 great albums by 10 different psychedelic groups and artists. First up, we have the Byrds' 1966 album, Fifth Dimension. An absolutely fantastic album that combines the folk of the early 60s with the electric drone of the emerging psychedelic sound. I think you can hear this mixture best in the song 8 Miles High. Next up, we have Strawberry Alarm Clock's 1967 effort, Incense and Peppermints. Now this one's on the poppier side, but it's still a fantastic time machine. The eponymous track needs no introduction. You've definitely heard this before somewhere. My third recommendation is 1967's Procol Harum. This is the one with the classic song A Whiter Shade of Pale, which you may have heard of. It's a good example of the psychedelic sound in the UK, taking on more influences from Baroque and classical music, as well as medieval and fantasy imagery. For our next recommendation, we have 1969's Santana. It's a great introduction to the psychedelic jam band, and the Latin influences are fantastic, especially when it comes to auxiliary percussion. And of course, this list wouldn't be complete without mentioning Jimi Hendrix. The album I've picked is Are You Experienced? I would check out the title track for some trippy backmasking effects and equally psychedelic lyrics. Next up, we have the Electric Prune self-titled album, which is a fantastic album from a foundational band and one of the first acts to introduce the wah-wah pedal to the genre. Our next recommendation is Donovan's 1966 album, Sunshine Superman. This is another great example of psychedelic music from the UK, although this time it is more influenced by the San Francisco sound. And of course, we have to have a Beatles album as well. I'm picking Magical Mystery Tour. Why did I not pick Sgt. Pepper's? Why did I not pick Revolver? I'm not sure. Listen to all of them. Next up, we have the 13th Floor Elevators' 1966 album, Psychedelic Sounds of the 13th Floor Elevators. So with a name like that, you know exactly what you're in for. This is a personal favorite of mine. It has such a wacky, naive kind of sound, you just can't help but falling in love with it. And lastly, we have Jefferson Airplane's 1967 album, Surrealistic Pillow. If you're only going to listen to one album on this list, I would probably make it this one. I think it covers so much of what the psychedelic movement was about. You get folk music, trippy effects, Eastern influences, countercultural lyrics, as well as some experimentation that doesn't really land. It's an absolute classic of the era, and it's our final recommendation for today. Anyway, I hope you enjoy those recommendations. Please like and subscribe if you found this video interesting, and leave a comment if there's a genre of music that you'd like to see me explore in a future video. But that's all for now. Stay curious, keep listening, and I'll see you next time.